Chapter 26 of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 26. It was not until the evening, after family prayers, that Angel found opportunity of broaching to his father one or two subjects near his heart. He had strung himself up to the purpose while kneeling behind his brothers on the carpet, studying the little nails in the heels of their walking boots. When the service was over they went out of the room with their mother, and Mr. Clare and himself were left alone. The young man first discussed with the elder his plans for the attainment of his position as a farmer on an extensive scale, either in England or in the colonies. His father then told him that, as he had not been put to the expense of sending Angel up to Cambridge, he had felt it his duty to set by a sum of money every year towards the purchase or lease of land for him some day, that he might not feel himself unduly slighted. "As far as worldly wealth goes," continued his father, "you will no doubt stand far superior to your brothers in a few years." This considerateness on old Mr. Clare's part led Angel onward to the other and dearer subject. He observed to his father that he was then 26, and that when he would start in the farming business he would require eyes in the back of his head to see to all matters. Someone would be necessary to superintend the domestic labours of his establishment whilst he was afield. Would it not be well, therefore, for him to marry? His father seemed to think this idea not unreasonable, and then Angel put the question. "What kind of wife do you think would be best for me as a thrifty, hard-working farmer?" "A truly Christian woman, who would be of help and a comfort to you in your goings out and your comings in. Beyond that it really matters little. Such a one can be found. Indeed, my earnest-minded friend and neighbour, Dr. Chance—" "But ought she not primarily be able to milk cows, churn good butter, and make immense cheeses, know how to sit hens and turkeys and rear chickens, to direct a field of labourers in an emergency, and estimate the value of sheep and calves?" "Yes, a farmer's wife, yes, certainly, it would be desirable." Mr. Clare the elder had plainly never thought of these points before. "I was going to add," he said, "that for a pure and saintly woman you will not find one more to your true advantage, and certainly not more to your mother's mind and my own, than your friend Mercy, whom you used to show a certain interest in. It is true that my neighbour Chant's daughter has lately caught up the fashion of the younger clergy round about us for decorating the communion table, altar, as I was shocked to hear her call it one day, with flowers and other stuff on festival occasions. But her father, who is quite as opposed to such flummery as I, said that it can be cured. It is a mere girlish outbreak, which I am sure will not be permanent." Yes, Mercy is good and devout, I know, but, father, don't you think that a young woman equally pure and virtuous as Miss Chant, but one who, in place of that lady's ecclesiastical accomplishments, understands the duties of farm life as well as a farmer himself, would suit me infinitely better?" His father persisted in his conviction that a knowledge of a farmer's wife's duties came second to a Pauline view of humanity, and the impulsive Angel, wishing to honour his father's feelings and to advance the cause of his heart at the same time, grew specious. He said that fate or Providence had thrown in his way a woman who possessed every qualification to be the helpmate of an agriculturalist, and was decidedly of a serious turn of mind. He would not say whether or not she had attached herself to the sound Low Church school of his father, but she would probably be open to conviction on that point. She was a regular churchgoer of simple faith, honest-hearted, receptive, intelligent, graceful to a degree, chaste as a vestal, and in personal appearance exceptionally beautiful. "Is she of a family such that you would care to marry into, a lady, in short?" asked his startled mother, who had come softly into the study during the conversation. "She is not what in common parlance is called a lady," said Angel unflinchingly, "for she is a cottager's daughter, as I am proud to say. But she is a lady nevertheless, in feeling and nature." "Mercy Chant is of a very good family." "Pooh! What's the advantage of that, mother?" said Angel quickly. "How is family to avail the wife of a man who has to rough it as I have, and shall have to do?" "Mercy is accomplished, and accomplishments have their charm," returned his mother, looking at him through her silver spectacles. "As to external accomplishments, what will be the use in them in the life I am going to lead? While as to her reading, I can take that in hand. She'll be apt pupil enough, as you would say if you knew her. She's brimful of poetry, actualized poetry, if I may use the expression. She lives what paper poets only write, and she's an unimpeachable Christian, I am sure, perhaps of the very tribe, genus and species you desire to propagate." "Oh, Angel, you are mocking." "Mother, I beg pardon. But as she really does attend church almost every Sunday morning, and is a good Christian girl, I'm sure you will tolerate any social shortcomings for the sake of that quality, and feel that I may do worse than choose her." Angel waxed quite earnest in that rather automatic orthodoxy in his beloved Tess, which, never dreaming that it might stand him in such good stead, he had been prone to slight when observing it practised by her and the other milkmaids, because of its obvious unreality amid beliefs essentially naturalistic. In their sad doubts as to whether their son had himself any right whatsoever to the title he claimed for the unknown young woman, Mr. and Mrs. Clare began to feel it as an advantage not to be overlooked that she at least was sound in her views, especially as the conjunction of the pair must have risen by an act of Providence, for Angel would never have made orthodoxy a condition of his choice. They said finally that it was better not to act in a hurry, but that they would not object to see her. Angel therefore refrained from declaring more particulars now. He felt that, single-minded and self-sacrificing as his parents were, there yet existed certain latent prejudices of theirs as middle-class people which would require some tact to overcome. For though legally at liberty to do as he chose, and though their daughter-in-law's qualifications could make no practical difference in their lives, in the probability of her living far away from them, he wished, for affection's sake, not to wound their sentiment in the most important decision of his life. He observed his own inconsistencies in dwelling upon accidents in Tess's life, as if they were vital features. It was for herself that he loved Tess, her soul, her heart, her substance, not for her skill in the dairy, her aptness as his scholar, and certainly not for her simple, formal faith professions. Her unsophisticated, open-air existence required no varnish of conventionality to make it palatable to him. He held that education had as yet but little affected the beats of emotion and impulse on which domestic happiness depends. It was probable that, in the lapse of ages, improved systems of moral and intellectual training would appreciably, perhaps considerably, elevate the involuntary and even the unconscious instincts of human nature, but up to the present-day culture, as far as he can see, might be said to have affected only the mental epiderm of those lives which had been brought under its influence. This belief was confirmed by his experience of women, which, having latterly been extended from the cultivated middle class into the rural community, had taught him how much less was the intrinsic difference between the good and wise woman of one social stratum and the good and wise woman of another social stratum than between the good and bad, the wise and the foolish, of the same stratum or class. It was the morning of his departure. His brothers had already left the vicarage to proceed on a walking tour in the north, whence one was to return to his college and the other to his curacy. Angel might have accompanied them, but preferred to rejoin his sweetheart at Talbothays. He would have been an awkward member of the party, for though the most appreciative humanist, the most ideal religionist, even the best versed Christologist of the three, there was alienation in the standing consciousness that his squareness would not fit the round hole that had been prepared for him. To neither Felix nor Cuthbert had he ventured to mention Tess. His mother made him sandwiches, and his father accompanied him on his own mare a little way along the road. Having fairly well advanced his own affairs, Angel listened in a willing silence as they jogged on together through the shady lanes to his father's account of his parish difficulties and the coldness of brother clergymen whom he loved, because of his strict interpretations of the New Testament by the light of what they deemed a pernicious Calvinistic doctrine. "Pernicious!" said Mr. Clare with genial scorn, and he proceeded to recount experiences which would show the absurdity of that idea. He told of wondrous conversions of evil livers, of which he had been the instrument, not only amongst the poor, but amongst the rich and well-to-do, and he also candidly admitted many failures. As an instance of the latter, he mentioned the case of a young upstart squire named d'Urberville, living some 40 miles off, in the neighbourhood of Trantridge. "Not one of the ancient d'Urbervilles of Kingsbere and other places?" asked his son. "That curiously historic worn-out family with its ghostly legend of the coach and four?" "Oh no, the original d'Urbervilles decayed and disappeared 60 or 80 years ago at least, I believe so. This seems to be a new family which has taken the name. For the credit of the former knightly line I hope they are spurious, I'm sure. But it is odd to hear you express interest in old families. I thought you set less store by them even than I." "You misapprehend me, father. You often do," said Angel with a little impatience. "Politically I am sceptical as to the virtue of their being old. Some of the wise even among themselves acclaim against their own succession, as Hamlet puts it, but lyrically, dramatically, and even historically, I am tenderly attached to them." This distinction, though by no means a subtle one, was yet too subtle for Mr. Clare the elder, and he went on with the story he had been about to relate, which was that after the death of the senior so-called d'Urberville, the young man developed the most culpable passions, though he had a blind mother whose condition should have made him know better. A knowledge of his career having come to the ears of Mr. Clare when he was in that part of the country preaching missionary sermons, he boldly took occasion to speak to the delinquent on his spiritual state. Though he was a stranger, occupying another's pulpit, he had felt this to be his duty, and took for his text the words from St. Luke, "Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee." The young man much resented this directness of attack, and in the war of words which followed, when they met, he did not scruple publicly to insult Mr. Clare without respect for his grey hairs. Angel flushed with distress. "Dear father," he said sadly, "I wish you would not expose yourself to such gratuitous pain from scoundrels." "Pain?" said his father, his rugged face shining in the ardour of self-abnegation. "The only pain to me was pain on his account. Poor foolish young man! Do you suppose his incensed words could give me any pain, or even his blows? Be reviled we bless, being persecuted we suffer it, being defamed we entreat. We are made as the filth of the world, and as the offscouring of all things unto this day. Those ancient and noble words of the Corinthians are strictly true at this present hour." "Not blows, father? He did not proceed to blows?" "No, he did not, though I have borne blows from men in a mad state of intoxication." "No." "A dozen times, my boy. What then? I have saved them from the guilt of murdering their own flesh and blood thereby, and they have lived to thank me and praise God." "May this young man do the same," said Angel fervently. "But I fear otherwise, from what you say." "We'll hope nevertheless," said Mr. Clare, "and I continue to pray for him, though on this side of the grave we shall probably never meet again. But after all, one of those poor words of mine may spring up in his heart as a good seed some day." Now, as always, Clare's father was sanguine as a child, and, though the younger could not accept his parents' narrow dogma, he revered his practice, and recognized the hero under the pietist. Perhaps he revered his father's practice even more now than ever, seeing that, in the question of making Tessie his wife, his father had not once thought of inquiring whether she were well provided or penniless. The same unworldliness was what had necessitated Angel's getting a living as a farmer, and would probably keep his brothers in the position of poor parsons for the term of their activities. Yet Angel admired it none the less. Indeed, despite his own heterodoxy, Angel often felt that he was nearer to his father on the human side than was either of his brethren. End of chapter 26.
Seven of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 27. An uphill and downdale ride of 20-odd miles through a garish midday atmosphere brought him in the afternoon to a detached knoll a mile or two west of Talbothays, whence he again looked into that green trough of sappiness and humidity, the vale of the Var or Froom. Immediately he began to descend from the upland to the fat alluvial soil below, the atmosphere grew heavier. The languid perfume of the summer fruits, the mists, the hay, the flowers, formed therein a vast pool of odour which at this hour seemed to make the animals, the very bees and butterflies, drowsy. Clare was now so familiar with the spot that he knew the individual cows by their names, when, a long distance off, he saw them dotted about the meads. It was with a sense of luxury that he recognized his power of viewing life here from its inner side, in a way that had been quite forgotten to him in his student days, and much as he loved his parents, he could not help being aware that to come here as now, after an experience of home life, affected him like throwing off splints and bandages, even the one customary curb on the humours of English rural society being absent in this place, Talbothays having no resident landlord. The denizens were all enjoying the usual afternoon nap of an hour or so, which the exceedingly early hours kept in summer-time rendered a necessity. At the door the wood-hooped pails, sodden and bleached by infinite scrubbings, hung like hats on a stand upon the forked and peeled limb of an oak fixed there for that purpose, all of them ready and dry for the evening milking. Angel entered and went through the silent passages of the house to the back quarters, where he listened for a moment. Sustained snores came from the cart-house, where some of the men were lying down. The grunt and squeal of sweltering pigs arose from the still further distance. The large-leaved rhubarb and cabbage plants slept too, their broad limp surfaces hanging in the sun like half-closed umbrellas. He unbridled and fed his horse, and as he re-entered the house the clock struck 3. 3 was the afternoon skimming hour, and with the stroke Clare heard the creaking of the floorboards above, and then the touch of a descending foot on the stairs. It was Tess's, who in another moment came down before his eyes. She had not heard him enter, and hardly realized his presence there. She was yawning, and he saw the red interior of her mouth as if it had been a snake's. She had stretched one arm so high above her coiled-up cable of hair that he could see its satin delicacy above the auburn. Her face was flushed with sleep, and her eyelids hung heavy over their pupils. The brim fullness of her nature breathed from her. It was a moment when a woman's soul is more incarnate than at any other time, when the most spiritual beauty bespeaks itself flesh, and sex takes the outside place in the presentation. Then those eyes flashed brightly through their filmy heaviness, before the remainder of her face was well awake. With an oddly compounded look of gladness, shyness, and surprise, she exclaimed, "Oh, Mr. Clare, how you frightened me! There had not at first been time for her to think of the changed relations which his declaration had introduced, but the full sense of the matter rose up in her face when she encountered Clare's tender look as he stepped forward to the bottom stair. "Dear darling Tessie," he whispered, putting his arm round her, and his face to her flushed cheek. "Don't, for heaven's sake, mister me any more. I've hastened back so soon because of you." Tess's excitable heart beat against his by way of reply, and there they stood upon the red brick floor of the entry, the sun slanting in by the window upon his back, as he held her tightly to his breast. Upon her inclining face, upon the blue veins of her temple, upon her naked arm and her neck, and into the depths of her hair. Having been lying down in her clothes, she was warm as a sunned cat. At first she would not look straight up at him, but her eyes soon lifted, and his plumbed the deepness of the ever-varying pupils, with their radiating fibrils of blue and black and grey and violet, while she regarded him as Eve at her second wakening might have regarded Adam. "I've got to go a-skimming," she pleaded, "and I've only old Deb to help me to-day. Mrs. Crick is gone to market with Mr. Crick, and Retty is not well, and the others are gone out somewhere, and won't be home till milking." As they retreated to the milk-house, Deborah Fyander appeared on the stairs. "I've come back, Deborah," said Mr. Clare upwards, "so I can help Tess with the skimming, and as you're very tired, I am sure, you needn't come down till milking time." Possibly Talbothays milk was not very thoroughly skimmed that afternoon. Tess was in a dream, wherein familiar objects appeared as having light and shade and position, but no particular outline. Every time she held the skimmer under the pump to cool it for the work, her hand trembled, the ardour of his affection being so palpable that she seemed to flinch under it like a plant in too burning a sun. Then he pressed her again to his side, and when she had done running her forefinger round the leads to cut off the cream edge, he cleaned it in nature's way, for the unconstrained manners of Talbothays Dairy came convenient now. "I may as well say it now as later, dearest," he resumed gently. "I wish to ask you something of a very practical nature, which I have been thinking of ever since that day last week in the meads. I shall soon want to marry, and being a farmer, you see, I shall require for my wife a woman who knows all about the management of farms. Will you be that woman, Tessie?" He put it in that way that she might not think he had yielded to an impulse of which his head would disapprove. She turned quite careworn. She had bowed to the inevitable result of proximity, the necessity of loving him, but she had not calculated upon this sudden corollary, which, indeed, Clare had put before her without quite meaning himself to do it so soon. With pain that was like the bitterness of dissolution, she murmured the words of her indispensable and sworn answer as an honourable woman. "Oh, Mr. Clare, I cannot be your wife. I cannot be." The sound of her own decision seemed to break Tess's very heart, and she bowed her face in her grief. "But Tess," he said, amazed at her reply, and holding her still more greedily close, "do you say no? Surely you love me?" "Oh yes, yes, and I would rather be yours than anybody's in the world," returned the sweet and honest voice of the distressed girl. "But I cannot marry you." "Tess," he said, holding her at arm's length, "you are engaged to marry someone else." "No, no." "Then why do you refuse me?" "I don't want to marry. I have not thought of doing it. I cannot. I only want to love you." "But why?" Driven to subterfuge, she stammered, "Your father is a parson, and your mother wouldn't like you to marry such as me. She will want you to marry a lady." "Nonsense. I've spoken to them both. That is partly why I went home." "I feel I cannot. Never, never," she echoed. "Is it too sudden to be asked thus, my pretty?" "Yes. I did not expect it." "If you will let it pass, please, Tessie, I will give you time," he said. "It was very abrupt to come home and speak to you all at once. I'll not allude to it again for a while." She again took up the shining skimmer, held it beneath the pump, and began anew. But she could not, as at other times, hit the exact undersurface of the cream with the delicate dexterity required, try as she might. Sometimes she was cutting down into the milk, sometimes in the air. She could hardly see, her eyes having filled with two blurring tears drawn forth by a grief which, to this her best friend and dear advocate, she could never explain. "I can't skim, I can't," she said, turning away from him. Not to agitate and hinder her longer, the considerate Clare began talking in a more general way. "You quite misapprehend my parents. They are the most simple-mannered people alive, and quite unambitious. They are two of the few remaining evangelical school. Tessie, are you an evangelical?" "I don't know." "You go to church very regularly, and our parson here is not very high, they tell me." Tess's ideas on the view of the parish clergyman, whom she had heard every week, seemed to be rather more vague than Clare's, who had never heard him at all. "I wish I could fix my mind on what I hear there more firmly than I do," she remarked as a safe generality. "It is often a great sorrow to me." She spoke so unaffectedly that Angel was sure in his heart that his father could not object to her on religious grounds, even though she did not know whether her principles were high, low, or broad. He himself knew that in reality the confused beliefs which she held, apparently imbibed in childhood, were, if anything, Tractarian as to phraseology, and pantheistic as to essence. Confused or otherwise, to disturb them was his last desire. "Leave thou thy sister when she prays, her early heaven, her happy views, nor thou with shadowed hint confuse a life that leads melodious days." He had occasionally thought the counsel less honest than musical, but he gladly conformed to it now. He spoke further of the incidents of his visit, of his father's mode of life, of his zeal for his principles. She grew serener, and the undulations disappeared from her skimming. As she finished one lead after another, he followed her, and drew the plugs for letting down the milk. "I fancied you looked a little downcast when you came in," she ventured to observe, anxious to keep away from the subject of herself. "Yes, well, My father has been talking a good deal to me of his troubles and difficulties, and the subject always tends to depress me. He is so zealous that he gets many snubs and buffetings from people in a different way of thinking from himself, and I don't like to hear of such humiliations to a man of his age, the more particularly as I don't think earnestness does any good when carried so far. He has been telling me of a very unpleasant scene in which he took part quite recently. He went as the deputy to some missionary society to preach in the neighbourhood of Trantridge, a place 40 miles from here, and made it his business to expostulate with a lax young cynic he met with somewhere about there, son of some landowner up that way, and who has a mother afflicted with blindness. My father addressed himself to the gentleman point blank, and there was quite a disturbance. It was very foolish of my father, I must say, to intrude his conversation upon a stranger when the probabilities were so obvious that it would be useless. But whatever he thinks to be his duty, that he'll do, in season or out of season. And of course he makes many enemies, not only among the absolutely vicious, but among the easy-going, who hate to be bothered. He says he glories in what happened, and that good may be done indirectly. But I wish he would not so wear himself out now he's getting old, and would leave such pigs to their wallowing. Tess's look had grown hard and worn, and her ripe mouth tragical, and she no longer showed any tremulousness. Clare's revived thoughts of his father prevented his noticing her particularly, and so they went on down the white row of liquid rectangles till they had finished and drained them off, when the other maids returned and took their pails, and Deb came to scald out the leads for the new milk. As Tess withdrew to go afield to the cows, he said to her softly, "And my question, Tessie?" "Oh, no, no," replied she, with grave hopelessness, as one who had heard anew the turmoil of her own past in the allusion of Alec d'Urberville. "It can't be." She went out toward the mead, joining the other milkmaids with a bound, as if to try to make the open air drive away her sad constraint. All the girls drew onward to the spot where the cows were grazing in the further mead, the bevy advancing with the bold grace of wild animals, the reckless, unchastened motion of women accustomed to unlimited space, in which they abandoned themselves to the air as a swimmer to the wave. It seemed natural enough to him now that Tess was again in sight to choose a mate from unconstrained nature, and not from the abodes of art. End of chapter 27.
Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 28. Her refusal, though unexpected, did not permanently daunt Clare. His experience of women was great enough for him to be aware that the negative often meant nothing more than the preface to the affirmative, and it was little enough for him not to know that in the manner of the present negative there lay a great exception to the dallyings of coyness. That she had already permitted him to make love to her he read as an additional assurance, not fully trowing that in the fields and pastures to sigh gratis is by no means deemed waste, love-making being here more often accepted inconsiderately and for its own sweet sake than in the carking, anxious homes of the ambitious, where a girl's craving for an establishment paralyses her healthy thought of a passion. "Tess, why did you say no in such a positive way?" he asked her in the course of a few days. She started. "Don't ask me. I told you why, partly. I'm not good enough, not worthy enough." "How? Not fine lady enough?" "Yes, something like that," murmured she. "Your friends would scorn me." "Indeed you mistake them. my father and mother. As for my brothers, I don't care." He clasped his fingers behind her back to keep her from slipping away. "Now, you did not mean it, sweet. I am sure you did not. You have made me so restless that I cannot read or play or do anything. I am in no hurry, Tess. But I want to know, to hear from your own warm lips, that you will some day be mine. Any time you may choose, but some day." She could only shake her head and look away from him. Clare regarded her attentively, conned the characters of her face as if they had been hieroglyphics. The denial seemed real. "Then I ought not to hold you in this way, ought I? I have no right to you, no right to seek out where you are, or to walk with you. Honestly, Tess, do you love any other man?" "How can you ask?" she said, with continued self-suppression. "I almost know that you do not, but then why do you repulse me?" "I don't repulse you. I like you to tell me you love me, and you may always tell me so as you go about with me, and never offend me." "But why will you not accept me as a husband?" "Ah, that's different. It is for your own good indeed, my dearest. Oh, believe me, it is only for your sake. I don't like to give myself the great happiness of promising to be yours in that way, because I'm sure I ought not to do it." "But you will make me happy." "Ah, you think so, but you don't know." In such times as this, apprehending the grounds of her refusal to be her modest sense of incompetence in matters social and polite, he would say that she was wonderfully well informed and versatile, which was certainly true, her natural quickness and her admiration for him having led her to pick up his vocabulary, his accent, and fragments of his knowledge to a surprising extent. After these contests and her victory she would go away by herself under the remotest cow if at milking time, or into the sedge, or into her room if at leisure interval, and mourn silently, not a minute after an apparently phlegmatic negative. The struggle was so fearful, her own heart was so strongly on the side of his, two ardent hearts against one poor little conscience, that she tried to fortify her resolution by every means in her power. She had come to Talbothays with a made-up mind. On no account could she agree to a step which might afterwards cause bitter rueing to her husband for his blindness in wedding her. And she held that what her conscience had decided for her when her mind was unbiased ought not to be overruled now. "Why don't someone tell him all about me?" she said. "It was only 40 miles off. Why hasn't it reached here? Somebody must know." Yet nobody seemed to know. Nobody told him. For 2 or 3 days no more was said. She guessed from the sad countenances of her chamber companions that they regarded her not only as the favourite, but as the chosen. But they could see for themselves that she did not put herself in his way. Tess had never before known a time in which the thread of her life was so distinctly twisted of 2 strands, positive pleasure and positive pain. At the next cheese-making the pair were again left alone together. The dairyman himself had been lending a hand, but Mr. Crick, as well as his wife, seemed latterly to have acquired a suspicion of mutual interest between these two, though they walked so circumspectly that suspicion was but of the faintest. Anyhow, the dairyman left them to themselves. They were breaking up the masses of curds before putting them into the vats. The operation resembled the act of crumbling bread on a large scale, and amid the immaculate whiteness of the curds Tess Durbeyfield's hands showed themselves of the pinkness of the rose. Angel, who was filling the vats with his handfuls, suddenly ceased and laid his hands flat upon hers. Her sleeves were rolled far above the elbow, and bending lower he kissed the inside vein of her soft arm. Although the early September weather was sultry, her arm, from her dabbling in the curds, was as cold and damp to his mouth as a new gathered mushroom, and tasted of the way. But she was such a sheaf of susceptibilities that her pulse was accelerated by the touch, her blood driven to her finger ends, and the cool arms flushed hot. Then, as though her heart had said, "Is coyness longer necessary? Truth is truth between man and woman, as between man and man," she lifted her eyes, and they beamed devotedly into his as her lip rose in a tender half-smile. "Do you know why I did that, Tess?" he said. "Because you love me very much." "Yes, and as a preliminary to a new entreaty." "Not again?" She looked a sudden fear that her resistance might break down under her own desire. "Oh, Tessie," he went on, "I cannot think why you are so tantalizing. Why do you disappoint me so? You seem almost like a coquette, upon my life you do, a coquette of the first urban water. They blow hot and blow cold, just as you do, and it is the very last sort of thing to expect to find in a retreat like Talbothays. And yet, dearest," he quickly added, observing how the remark had cut her, "I know you to be the most honest, spotless creature that ever lived, so how can I suppose you a flirt? Tess, why don't you like the idea of being my wife, if you love me as you seem to do?" "I have never said I don't like the idea, and I never could say it, because it isn't true." The stress now getting beyond endurance, her lip quivered, and she was obliged to go away. Clare was so pained and perplexed that he ran after and caught her in the passage. "Tell me, tell me!" he said, passionately clasping her in forgetfulness of his curdy hands. "Do tell me that you won't belong to any one but me." I will tell you," she exclaimed, "and I will give you a complete answer, if you will let go now. I will tell you my experiences, all about myself, all." "Your experiences, dear, yes, certainly, any number." He expressed assent in loving satire, looking into her face. "My Tess has, no doubt, almost as many experiences as that wild convolvulus out there on the garden hedge that opened itself this morning for the first time. Tell me anything, but don't use that wretched expression any more about not being worthy of me." "I will try not, and I'll give you my reasons to-morrow, next week." "Say on Sunday?" "Yes, on Sunday." At last she got away, and did not stop in her retreat till she was in the thicket of pollard willows at the lower side of the barton, where she could be quite unseen. Here Tess flung herself down upon the rustling undergrowth of spear-grass as upon a bed, and remained crouching in palpitating misery, broken by momentary shoots of joy, which her fears about the ending could not altogether suppress. In reality she was drifting into acquiescence. Every seesaw of her breath, every wave of her blood, every pulse singing in her ears, was a voice that joined with nature in revolt against her scrupulousness. Reckless, inconsiderate acceptance of him, to close with him at the altar, revealing nothing and chancing discovery, to snatch ripe pleasure before the iron teeth of pain could have time to shut upon her. That was what love counselled. And in almost a terror of ecstasy Tess divined that, despite her many months of lonely self-chastisement, wrestlings, communings, schemes to lead a future of austere isolation, love's counsel would prevail. The afternoon advanced, and still she remained among the willows. She heard the rattle of taking down the pails from the forked stands. the wah wah which accompanied the getting together of the cows, but she did not go to the milking. They would see her agitation, and the dairyman, thinking the cause to be love alone, would good-naturedly tease her, and that harassment could not be borne. Her lover must have guessed her overwrought state, and invented some excuse for her non-appearance, for no inquiries were made or calls given. At 6:30 the sun settled down upon the levels, with the aspect of a great forge in the heavens, and presently a monstrous pumpkin-like moon arose on the other hand. The pollard willows, tortured out of their natural shape by incessant choppings, became spiny-head monsters as they stood up against it. She went in and upstairs without a light. It was now Wednesday. Thursday came, and Angel looked thoughtfully at her from a distance, but intruded in no way upon her. The indoor milkmaids, Marian and the rest, seemed to guess that something definite was afoot, for they did not force any remarks upon her in the bedchamber. Friday passed. Saturday. Tomorrow was the day. "I shall give way. I shall say yes. I shall let myself marry him. I cannot help it," she jealously panted with her hot face in the pillow that night, on hearing one of the other girls sigh his name in her sleep. "I cannot bear to let anybody have him but me. Yes, it is a wrong to him, and may kill him when he knows. Oh, my heart! Oh, oh, oh!" End of chapter 28.
The 29 of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 29. "Now, who mid ye think I've heard news o' this morning?" said Dairyman Crick, as he sat down to breakfast next day, with a riddling gaze round the munching men and maids. "Now, just who mid ye think?" One guessed, and another guessed. Mrs. Crick did not guess, because she knew already. "Well," said the dairyman, "'tis that slack-twisted Orr's bird of a feller Jack Dollop. He's lately got married to a widow woman." "Not Jack Dollop? A villain to think of that," said a milker. The name entered quickly into Tess Durbeyfield's consciousness, for it was the name of the lover who had wronged his sweetheart, and had afterwards been so roughly used by the young woman's mother in the butter churn. "And has he married the valiant matron's daughter as he promised?" asked Angel Clare absently, as he turned over the newspaper he was reading at the little table, to which he was always banished by Mrs. Crick in her sense of his gentility. "Not he, sir. Never meant to," replied the dairyman. "As I say, 'tis a widow woman, and she had money, it seems, £50 a year or so, and that was all he was after. They were married in a great hurry, and then she told him that by marrying she had lost her £50 a year. Just fancy the state of my gentleman's mind at the news. Never such a cat and dog life as they've been leading ever since. Serves him well, be right, but unlucky the poor woman gets the worst on't." "Well, the silly body should have told him sooner that the ghost of her first man would trouble him," said Mrs. Crick. "Ay, ay," responded the dairyman indecisively. "Still, you can see exactly how 'twas. She wanted a home, and didn't like to run the risk of losing him. Don't ye think that was something like it, maidens?" He glanced toward the row of girls. "She ought to told him just before they went out to church, when he could hardly have backed out. exclaimed Marian. "Yes, she ought," agreed Izz. "She must have seen what he was after, and should have refused him," said Retty spasmodically. "And what do you say, my dear?" asked the dairyman of Tess. "I think she ought to have told him the true state of things, or else refused him. I don't know," replied Tess, the bread and butter choking her. "Be cussed if I'd done either on't," said Beck Nibbs, a married helper from one of the cottages. "All's fair in love and war. I'd ha' married en just as she did, and if he'd ha' said 2 words to me about not telling him beforehand anything whatsomever about my first chap that I hadn't choose to tell, I'd ha' knocked him down wi' a rolling pin, a scram little fellow like he. Any woman could do it." The laughter which followed this sally was supplemented only by a sorry smile, for form's sake, from Tess. What was comedy to them was tragedy to her, and she could hardly bear the mirth. She soon rose from table, and, with an impression that Clare would follow her, went along a little wriggling path, now stepping to one side of the irrigating channels and now to the other, till she stood by the main stream of the Var. Men had been cutting the water weeds higher up the river, and masses of them were floating past her, moving islands of green crowfoot, whereupon she might almost have ridden, long locks of which weed had lodged against the piles driven to keep the cows from crossing. Yes, there was the pain of it, this question of a woman telling her story. The heaviest of crosses to herself seemed but amusement to others. It was as if people should laugh at martyrdom. "Tessie!" came from behind her, and Clare sprang across the gully, alighting beside her feet. "My wife soon?" "No, no, I cannot. For your sake, oh, Mr Clare, for your sake I say no." "Tess!" "Still I say no," she repeated. Not expecting this, he had put his arm lightly round her waist the moment after speaking, beneath her hanging tail of hair. The younger dairymaids, including Tess, breakfasted with their hair loose on Sunday mornings, before building it up extra high for attending church, a style which they could not adopt when milking with their heads against the cows. If she had said yes instead of no, he would have kissed her. It had evidently been his intention, but a determined negative deterred his scrupulous heart. Their condition of domiciliary comradeship put her, as the woman, to such disadvantage by its enforced intercourse, that he felt it unfair to her to exercise any pressure of blandishment which he might have honestly employed had she been better able to avoid him. He released her momentarily imprisoned waist, and withheld the kiss. It all turned on that release. What had given her strength to refuse him this time was solely the tale of the widow told by the dairyman, and that would have been overcome in another moment. But Angel said no more. His face was perplexed. He went away. Day after day they met, somewhat less constantly than before, and thus 2 or 3 weeks went by. The end of September drew near, and she could see in his eye that he might ask her again. His plan of procedure was different now, as though he had made up his mind that her negatives were after all only coyness and youth, startled by the novelty of the proposal. The fitful evasiveness of her manner when the subject was under discussion countenanced the idea, so he played a more coaxing game, and while never going beyond words or attempting the renewal of caresses, he did his utmost orally. In this way Clare persistently wooed her in undertones like that of the purling milk, at the cow's side, at skimmings, at butter-makings, at cheese-makings, among broody poultry, and among farrowing pigs, as no milkmaid was ever wooed before by such a man. Tess knew that she must break down. Neither a religious sense of a certain moral validity in the previous union, nor a conscientious wish for candour could hold out against it much longer. She loved him so passionately, and he was so godly in her eyes, and being, though untrained, instinctively refined, her nature cried for his tutelary guidance. And thus, though Tess kept repeating to herself, "I can never be his wife," the words were in vain. A proof of her weakness lay in the very utterance of what calm strength would not have taken the trouble to formulate. Every sound of his voice, beginning on the cold subject, stirred her with a terrifying bliss, and she coveted the recantation she feared. His manner was, what man's is not, so much that of one who would love and cherish and defend her under any conditions, changes, charges or revelations, that her gloom lessened as she basked in it. The season meanwhile was drawing onward to the equinox, and though it was still fine, the days were much shorter. The dairy had again worked by morning candlelight for a long time, and a fresh renewal of Clare's pleading occurred one morning between 3 and 4. She had run up in her bedgown to his door to call him as usual, then had gone back to dress and call the others, and in 10 minutes was walking to the head of the stairs with a candle in her hand. At the same moment he came down the steps from above in his shirt-sleeves, and put his arm across the stairway. "Now, Miss Flirt, before you go down," he said peremptorily, "it is a fortnight since I spoke, and this won't do any longer. You must tell me what you mean, or I shall have to leave this house. My door was ajar just now, and I saw you. For your own safety I must go. You don't know. Well, is it to be yes at last?" "I'm only just up, Mr Clare, and it's too early to take me to task," she pouted. "You need not call me Flirt. 'Tis cruel and untrue. Wait till by and by. Please wait till by and by. I will really think seriously about it between now and then. Let me go downstairs." She looked a little like what she said she was as, holding the candle sideways, she tried to smile away the seriousness of her words. "Call me Angel, then, and not Mr Clare." "Angel." "Angel, dearest, why not?" "'Twould mean that I agree, wouldn't it?" "It would only mean that you love me, even if you cannot marry me, and you were so good as to own that long ago." "Very well, then. Angel dearest, if I must," she murmured, looking at her candle, a roguish curl coming upon her mouth, notwithstanding her suspense. Clare had resolved never to kiss her until he had obtained her promise, but somehow, as Tess stood there in her pretty tucked-up milking gown, her hair carelessly heaped upon her head till there should be leisure to arrange it when skimming and milking were done, he broke his resolve and brought his lips to her cheek for one moment. She passed downstairs very quickly, never looking back at him or saying another word. The other maids were already down, and the subject was not pursued. Except Marian, they all looked wistfully and suspiciously at the pair in the sad yellow rays which the morning candles emitted in contrast with the first cold signals of the dawn without. When skimming was done, which, as the milk diminished with the approach of autumn, was a lessening process day by day, Retty and the rest went out. The lovers followed them. "Our tremulous lives are so different from theirs, are they not?" he musingly observed to her, as he regarded the 3 figures tripping before him through the frigid pallor of opening day. "Not so very different, I think," she said. "Why do you think that?" "There are very few women's lives that are not tremulous," Tess replied, pausing over the new word as if it impressed her. "There's more in those 3 than you think." "What is in them?"
"Almost either of them,"
she began, perhaps would make a properer wife than I, and perhaps they love you as well as I, almost." "Oh, Tessie!" There were signs that it was almost an exquisite relief to her to hear the impatient exclamation, though she had resolved so intrepidly not to let generosity make one bid against herself. That was now done, and she had not the power to attempt self-immolation a second time then. They were joined by a milker from one of the cottages, and no more was said on that which concerned them so deeply. But Tess knew that this day would decide it. In the afternoon several of the dairyman's household and assistants went down to the meads as usual, a long way from the dairy, where many of the cows were milked without being driven home. The supply was getting less as the animals advanced in calf, and the supernumerary milkers of the lush green season had been dismissed. The work progressed leisurely. Each pailful was poured into tall cans that stood in a large spring waggon which had been brought upon the scene, and when they were milked the cows trailed away. Dairyman Crick, who was there with the rest, his wrapper gleaming miraculously white against the leaden evening sky, suddenly looked at his heavy watch. "Why, 'tis later than I thought," he said. "Begad, we shan't be soon enough with this milk at the station if we don't mind. There's no time to-day to take it home and mix it with the bulk afore sending off. It must go to station straight from here. Who'll drive it across?" Mr Clare volunteered to do so, though it was none of his business, asking Tess to accompany him. The evening, though sunless, had been warm and muggy for the season, and Tess had come out with her milking hood only, naked-armed and jacketless, certainly not dressed for a drive. She therefore replied by glancing over her scant habiliments, but Clare gently urged her. She assented by relinquishing her pail and stool to the dairyman to take home, and mounted the spring waggon beside Clare. End of chapter 29.
of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy, read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 30. In the diminishing daylight they went along the level roadway through the meads, which stretched away into grey miles, and were backed into the extreme edge of distance by the swarthy and abrupt slopes of Egdon Heath. On its summit stood clumps and stretches of fir trees, whose notched tips appeared like battlemented towers crowning black-fronted castles of enchantment. They were so absorbed in the sense of being close to each other that they did not begin talking for a long while, and the silence being broken only by the clucking of the milk in the tall cans behind them. The lane they followed was so solitary that the hazelnuts had remained on the boughs till they slipped from their shells, and the blackberries hung in heavy clusters. Every now and then Angel would fling the lash of his whip round one of these, pluck it off, and give it to his companion. The dull sky soon began to tell its meaning by sending down herald drops of rain, and the stagnant air of the day changed into a fitful breeze which played about their faces. The quicksilvery glaze on the rivers and pools vanished. From broad mirrors of light they changed to lustreless sheets of lead, with a surface like a rasp. But that spectacle did not affect her preoccupation. Her countenance, a natural carnation slightly embrowned by the season, had deepened its tinge with the beating of the raindrops, and her hair, which the pressure of the cow's flanks had, as usual, caused to tumble down from its fastenings and stray beyond the curtain of her calico bonnet, was made clammy by the moisture, till it hardly was better than seaweed. "I ought not to have come, I suppose," she murmured, looking at the sky. "I'm sorry for the rain," said he, "but how glad I am to have you here." Remote Egdon disappeared by degrees behind the liquid gauze. The evening grew darker, and roads being crossed by gates, it was not safe to drive faster than at a walking pace. The air was rather chill. "I'm so afraid you will get cold with nothing upon your arms and shoulders," he said. "Creep close to me, and perhaps the drizzle won't hurt you much. I should be sorrier still if I did not think that the rain might be helping me." She imperceptibly crept closer, and he wrapped round them both a large piece of sailcloth, which was sometimes used to keep the sun off the milk cans. Tess held it from slipping off him as well as herself, Clare's hands being occupied. "Now we are all right again." "Oh no, we are not. It runs down into my neck a little, and it must still be more into yours. That's better. Your arms are like wet marble, Tess. Wipe them in the cloth. Now, if you want to stay quiet, you will not get another drop. Well, dear, about that question of mine, that long-standing question." The only reply that he could hear for a little while was the smack of the horses' hoofs on the moistening road, and the cluck of the milk in the cans behind them. "Do you remember what I said?" "I do," she replied. "Before we get home, mind." "I'll try." He said no more then. As they drove on, the fragment of an old manor house of Caroline date rose against the sky, and was in due course passed and left behind. "That," he observed, to entertain her, "is an interesting old place, one of the several seats which belong to an ancient Norman family formerly of great influence in this country, the d'Urbervilles. I never pass one of their residences without thinking of them. There's something very sad in the extinction of a family of renown, even if it was fierce, domineering, feudal renown." "Yes," said Tess. They crept along towards a point in the expanse of shade just at hand at which a feeble light was beginning to assert its presence, a spot where by day a fitful white streak of stream, at intervals beyond the dark green background, denoted intermittent moments of contact between their secluded world and modern life. Modern life stretched out its stream feeler to this point 3 or 4 times a day, touched their native existences, and quickly withdrew its feeler again, as if what it touched had been uncongenial. They reached the feeble light, which came from the smoky lamp of a little railway station, a poor enough terrestrial star, yet in one sense of more importance to Talbothays Dairy and mankind than the celestial ones to which it stood in such humiliating contrast. The cans of new milk were unladen in the rain, Tess getting a little shelter from a neighbouring holly tree. Then there was the hissing of a train, which drew up almost silently upon the wet rails, and the milk was rapidly swung, can by can, into the truck. The light of the engine flashed for a second upon Tess Durbeyfield's figure, motionless under the great holly tree. No object could have looked more foreign to the gleaming cranks and wheels than this unsophisticated girl, with the round bare arms, the rainy face and hair, the suspended attitude of a friendly leopard at pause, the print gown of no date or fashion, and the cotton bonnet drooping on her brow. She mounted again beside her lover, with a mute obedience characteristic of impassioned natures at times, and when they had wrapped themselves up over head and ears in the sailcloth again, they plunged back into the now thick night. Tess was so receptive that the few minutes of contact with the whirl of material progress lingered in her thought. "Londoners will drink it at their breakfast to-morrow, won't they?" she asked. "Strange people that we have never seen." "Yes, I suppose they will, though not as we send it. when its strength has been lowered so that it might not get up into their heads. Noblemen and noblewomen, ambassadors and centurions, ladies and tradeswomen, and babies who have never seen a cow. Well, yes, perhaps, particularly centurions. Who don't know anything of us, and where it comes from, or think how we two drove miles across the moor tonight in the rain that it might reach them in time. We did not drive entirely on account of these precious Londoners. We drove a little on our own, on account of that anxious matter which you will, I'm sure, set at rest, dear Tess. Now, permit me to put it in this way. You belong to me already, you know. Your heart, I mean, does it not? You know as well as I. Oh, yes, yes. Then if your heart does, why not your hand? My only reason was on account of you, on account of a question. I have something to tell you. But suppose it to be entirely for my happiness and my worldly convenience also? Oh yes, if it is for your happiness and worldly convenience. But my life before I came here, I want... Well, it is for my convenience as well as my happiness. If I have a very large farm, either English or colonial, you will be invaluable as a wife to me. Better than a woman out of the largest mansion in the country. So please, please, dear Tessie, disabuse your mind of the feeling that you will stand in my way. But my history, I want you to know it. You must let me tell you. You will not like me so well. Tell it if you wish to, dearest. This precious history, then. Yes, I was born at so-and-so, Anno Domini. I was born at Marlott, she said, catching at his words as a help, lightly as they were spoken. And I grew up there, and I was in the 6th standard when I left school, and they said I had a great aptness and should make a good teacher, so it was settled that I should be one. But there was trouble in my family. Father was not very industrious, and he drank a little. Yes, yes, poor child, nothing new. He pressed her more closely to his side. And then there is something very unusual about it, about me. I was... Tess's breath quickened. Yes, dearest, never mind. I am not a D'Urberville, but a d'Urberville, a descendant of the same family as those that occupied the old house we passed, and we are all gone to nothing. A d'Urberville, indeed. And is that all the trouble, dear Tess? Yes, she answered faintly. Well, why should I love you less after knowing this? I was told by the dairyman that you hated old families. Well, it is true in one sense. I do hate the aristocratic principle of blood before everything, and do think that as reasoners the only pedigrees we ought to respect are those spiritual ones of the wise and virtuous, without regard to corporeal paternity. But I am extremely interested in this news. You can have no idea how interested I am. Are you not interested yourself in being one of that well-known line? No. I have thought it sad, especially since coming here and knowing that many of the hills and fields I see once belonged to my father's people. But other hills and fields belong to Retty's people, and perhaps others to Marion's, so that I don't value it particularly. Yes, it is surprising how many of the present tillers of the soil were once owners of it, and I sometimes wonder that a certain school of politicians don't make a capital out of the circumstance, but they don't seem to know it. I wonder that I did not see the resemblance of your name to d'Urberville and trace the manifest corruption. And this was the carking secret. She had not told. At the last moment her courage had failed her. She feared his blame for not telling him sooner. Her instinct of self-preservation was stronger than her candour. Of course, continued the unwitting Clare, I should have been glad to know you to be descended exclusively from the long-suffering, dumb, unrecorded rank and file of the English nation, and not from the self-seeking few who have made themselves powerful at the expense of the rest. But I'm corrupted away from that by my affection for you, Tess," he laughed as he spoke, "and made selfish likewise. For your own sake I rejoice in your descent. Society is hopelessly snobbish, and this fact of your extraction may make an appreciable difference to its acceptance of you as my wife, after I have made you the well-read woman that I mean to make you. My mother too, poor soul, will think so much better of you on account of it. Tess, you must spell your name correctly, d'Urberville, from this very day." "I like the other way rather best." "But you must, dearest. Good heavens! Why, dozens of mushroom millionaires would jump at such a possession. By the by, there's one of that kidney who has taken the name. Where have I heard of him? Up in the neighbourhood of the Chase, I think. Why, he is the very man who had that rumpus with my father I told you of. What an odd coincidence!" "Angel, I think I would rather not take the name. It is unlucky, perhaps." She was agitated. "Now then, Mistress Teresa d'Urberville, I have you. Take my name, and so you will escape yours. The secret is out, so why should you any longer refuse me?" "If it is sure to make you happy to have me as your wife, and you feel that you do wish to marry me very, very much—" "I do, dearest, of course." "I mean that it is only your wanting me very much, and being hardly able to keep alive without me, whatever my offence is, that would make me feel I ought to say I will." "You will. You do say it, I know. You will be mine for ever and ever." He clasped her close and kissed her. "Yes." She had no sooner said it than she burst into a dry, hard sobbing, so violent that it seemed to rend her. Tess was not a hysterical girl by any means, and he was surprised. "Why do you cry, dearest?" "I can't tell quite. I'm so glad to think of being yours and making you happy." "But this does not seem very much like gladness, my Tessie." "I mean, I cry because I've broken down in my vow. I said I would die unmarried." "But if you love me, you would like me to be your husband?" "Yes, yes, yes. But oh, I sometimes wish I had never been born." "Now, my dear Tess, if I did not know that you are very much excited and very inexperienced, I should say that remark was not very complimentary. How came you to wish that if you care for me? Do you care for me? I wish you would prove it in some way." "How can I prove it more than I have done?" she cried in a distraction of tenderness. "Will this prove it more?" She clasped his neck, and for the first time Clare learned what an impassioned woman's kisses were like upon the lips of one whom she loved with all her heart and soul, as Tess loved him. "There, now do you believe?" she asked, flushed and wiping her eyes. "Yes, I never really doubted. Never, never." So they drove on through the gloom, forming one bundle inside the sailcloth, the horse going as he would, and the rain driving against them. She had consented. She might as well have agreed at first. The appetite for joy which pervades all creation, that tremendous force which sways humanity to its purpose, as the tide sways the helpless weed, was not to be controlled by vague lucubrations over the social rubric. "I must write to my mother," she said. "You don't mind my doing that?" "Of course not, dear child. You are a child to me, Tess, not to know how very proper it is to write to your mother at such a time, and how wrong it would be in me to object. Where does she live?" "In the same place, Marlott, on the further side of Blackmoor Vale." "Ah, then I have seen you before this summer." "Yes, at that dance on the green. But you would not dance with me." "Oh, I hope that is not of ill omen for us now. End of chapter 30.